Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to what is an extremely charming town and even more charming people. I'm glad I'm here. As Nick says, two years later, what are we to make of this process of change that has started in the Arab world? The world seems to have gone, in a span of 2 short years, from calling it an Arab Spring and having these romantic dreams that the toppling of leaders is going to somehow instantaneously result in democratic transitions, to now probably calling it an Arab inferno, an Arab winter, fear of the rise of Islamists, fear that the region has been sort of lost to illiberal democracies forever. Both characterizations, in my view, of course, are extremely simplistic. This is a process of change. My departure point is that the Arab world, until the Arab awakenings of 2 years ago, was in a state of artificially induced stability. It was not a stable region. It was kept stable by regimes who have closed the political space and did not allow any opposition party basically to operate. And as such, that status quo was not sustainable. If you agree with this characterization, then you must, as Robin and Nick and many others have said, you must also understand that this is a process that is going to be measured in decades, not in months and not in years. And if one is to look at it through the prism of a two-year window, then you will get all the heartburns that all of us do from watching the daily news. But if you look at it as a process of change, which must run its course, then I think that you will see that not all the developments in the Arab world have been that negative. Before the Arab awakenings, I would say that countries of the Arab world have all been lumped into one category. That believed that time is an infinite commodity. And it told their people that they have all the time in the world, that bread must come before freedom, that stomachs must be filled before ballot boxes are. This was the basically main notion that all Arab regimes, monarchist and republican alike, preached to their people. After the Arab awakenings, I would characterize Arab countries as being now in two categories: those who have some time left and those whose time is up. Those whose time is up basically have surrendered the pace of reform to the street. They kept promising their people reform and not delivering on it until people said, enough is enough. We're going to take matters into our own hands, and we're going to see if we can move this reform process forward. And these are the countries we all know about: Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, Syria, still in the process of transition. And then you have the other category, those who have some time left. Ironically, they mostly belong to the monarchies of the Arab world, both the poor and the rich ones. You have 8 monarchies in the Arab world, the 6 rich Gulf states, and the poor monarchies of Jordan and Morocco. In the Gulf, what was attempted so far is to deal with this process either through financial or security means. Whether in Bahrain or in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, either financial means were used, or in the case of Bahrain, security means, in order to either stop or at least delay this process of change. And frankly, it has worked, at least for a while, with the rich monarchies. With the poor monarchies, they're trying to get ahead of the street by promising people a reform process that would hopefully convince their people that they don't need to go to the street and that reform from above can work. I don't think that's going on very well, even though Morocco has done better than Jordan. But in each of these countries, there has not been a sustained, serious, and gradual reform process that would lead not just to the implementation of ad hoc reforms or to reforms about process, but that would lead to power sharing. And this notion that from now on in the Arab world, if leaders want to keep their power, they have to share it, is a very difficult notion to internalize. And indeed, in my view, it has not been internalized by any Arab leader, despite all of the changes that we have seen so far. Having said that, I would like to look at some trends that are already emerging after 2 years of transition. And I would still maintain the hope that Robin gave us yesterday and build on it in what I see is going on in much of the Arab world. First, we have a battle of ideas that is being waged in the Arab world today. It's a battle that was supposed to start decades ago, certainly at least post-independence, and it has not started. All Arab governments alike, post-independence, have not given diversity and pluralism any attention. And so they ruled without a system of checks and balances in an unaccountable way, and the political space was closed. This is the first time in maybe 100 years that the political space is really opened. And when it is opened, you're going to see all kinds of ideas being discussed, both religious and secular. But it's a process that is healthy and must take its course. What I hope for is that this does not become a process of secularism against Islamism. Because if it becomes that, a battle between the secular elements on one hand and the Islamists on the other, then whoever wins that battle is going to be the new dictator of the Arab world. This must be a battle for pluralism, where both the secular elements and the religious elements as well fight for the right of everybody to be included and no one to be excluded. We're not seeing that fight so far. So far, it has largely been a battle between secular elements and Islamists over dominating the political scene. And maybe it is to be expected after 2 short years. But I'm hoping, and I'll talk about this later, that the new generation in the Arab world does not see this as a zero-sum game between one discourse over the other. The second trend that I think is being made very clear is that political parties and forces from now on need to work on the ground, much like the Islamists did. Secular forces, not all of them, but most of them in the Arab world tend to be elitist, tend to speak from behind podiums as I am doing today, rather than work on the ground, build networks, build organizational capabilities, develop clear programs, have financial capabilities, and do what the Islamists have been very well at doing, working on the ground. And I think that this is something that is only dawning now on some secular forces that are emerging in the post-Arab awakening period, but it is something that will take, of course, decades before these forces can credibly offer themselves as alternatives to the Islamists who have benefited from decades of organization. By the way, this is not unique to the Arab world. In emerging democracies from Guatemala to Indonesia, in all parts of the world, emerging new parties face the same problem. People are skeptical of them. They don't have any organizational capability. People look at them as parties that want to win elections and not work on the ground. I mean, all of these problems are there in many, many parts of the world. And so one has to give this process time. Many of these new secular forces will end up anyway disappearing and quickly. But some of them will succeed. Robin yesterday talked about 160 parties in Libya contesting the elections. Once again, that is not strange. That should not be surprising. In Spain, when it made the transition from Franco to democracy, 161 parties in Spain contested the first elections in 1977. In Tunisia, 116 parties contested the first elections. I doubt, but how many of these parties ended up with representation in parliament? In Tunisia, out of the 116, 8 parties were able to get more than one person inside parliament. And so this is a process, again, of evolution that people, I think, should not be afraid of. The third emerging trend, in my view, is that what I call the secular and religious holiness of parties is over. For the longest time, people were not allowed to criticize their secular leaders in the Arab world. Criticism of their leaders was tantamount to being sacrilegious almost. And the same applied to religious parties as well. If you criticized the Islamists, you were seen as criticizing God himself or herself. That halo around Islamists as well as secular parties is over. Once both came to the political field, it is now fair game to criticize them right, left, and center. When the presidential debates took place in Egypt, between Amr Musa, let's say, and Abdel Mun'im Abu al-Futuh, Amr Musa would look Abu al-Futuh in the eye on national TV and said, "I don't trust you, you're an Islamist." He could never have said that 5 years ago. The liberals, you know, the word liberal is a bad word until the Arab uprisings in the Arab world. They were seen as Western, they were seen as totally alien to Arab culture. Today, the liberals in Egypt, you know, have their own parties and have actually won a significant number of deputies in the Egyptian parliament. The fourth emerging trend is that economic reform without political reform does not work anymore. The central concept that all Arab governments pushed before the Arab awakenings, that we must put bread on the table before people, you know, can learn about democracy and make wise choices, basically the Chinese model. Let's first put bread on the table. We will worry about governance later on. Sort of similar to Nasser's motto in Egypt 50 years ago, no voice, you know, لا صوت يعلو فوق صوت المعركة. In other words, don't talk, no voice is allowed to rise over that of the battle. He talked about the battle to liberate Palestine at the time. In other words, we must focus and channel all our energies into one basic objective, which is economic reform, before we tackle political reform. What was the result? The result was that, yes, economic liberalization has taken place, and growth has, at least at the macro level, has been achieved in many Arab countries. But because there was no parallel process of developing a system of checks and balances, when abuses were made as a result of liberalization, of privatization of state assets, etc., and abuses were certainly made as they would in any other part of the world, they were not checked. They were not checked because we did not have strong parliaments in the Arab world, and the cronies around the regimes in the Arab world ended up reaping most of the benefits from this economic reform process. Economic reform now has a bad name in the Arab world. Not because it is not needed, but because its results so far were not felt by the average citizen. And from now on, economic reform, if it is to be credible, and it's an uphill battle to convince people again of the need for economic reform, to lift subsidies, to retarget them, to bring in foreign investment, to privatize, etc., to convince people that they should go along with this process, you will have to convince them that there is a parallel political reform process in which their voices are heard and in which they would feel comfortable that they are electing members of parliament that are able to exercise oversight over the executive, something which is not the case today. In my own view, actually, the economic challenges that are facing many countries in the Arab world today, including, by the way, in Egypt, I was just there last week, and the economic situation is extremely dire. But economic challenges in the Arab world, in my view, might have a positive effect on the political reform process, particularly in countries that have not so far undergone transition. Take my own country as an example, where energy prices were raised, oil prices were raised a few months ago, and energy prices are going to have to be raised any time now. The ability of unelected governments to raise such prices and convince people to go along is going to be increasingly diminished. And from now on, people or governments that will have to take very difficult economic choices and decisions will feel increasingly necessary to take them in parallel with developing and opening up their political systems. Otherwise, people are not going to accept that. The fifth, I lost track, trend is the emergence of third forces in the Arab world. For the longest time, we've had this bipolar monopoly on political life between a political elite which has, as I said, ruled without a system of checks and balances, and an Islamist opposition whose commitment to cultural, religious, and political diversity is suspect at best. We have not had many third forces in the Arab world. Those who believe both in the right of everybody to be included and those who also tend to be secular in nature and not try to impose their cultural or religious views on society. Are we witnessing the emergence of these third forces? It depends on the countries that you look at. We have seen such forces emerge in Egypt. We have seen such forces emerge in Tunisia, not in Jordan, and, well, maybe in Libya also. But so far, most of these forces' commitment to democratic norms is equally lacking than the same commitment given by Islamist forces. In other words, so far in the Arab world, in my view, commitment to true democracy from both the Islamist and secular forces is at best at lip service. People talk about democratic norms, but they don't practice it. The secular forces in Egypt were more than happy last year to stand by the army when the army was seen to take measures against the Islamists, because it served their short-term needs. And in other words, what they accused the Islamists of doing, standing against democracy and pluralism, they actually practiced it themselves. The emergence of third forces that don't believe in selective democracy, because selective democracy is no democracy at all. those who believe in the right of others to be included, even if they differ with these other forces, is a phenomenon that has not, in my view, still started in the Arab world. And I hope it does. That hope lies probably with the new generation. The old generation does not seem able or ready to embrace true democratic norms, whether from the Islamists or the secular forces. And at least the new generation that I talk to in places such as Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Morocco, and others, seems aware of this, seems aware of the need to embrace democratic norms more than their parents did, but lack the organization and capability, lack the leadership and the clear programs that go with it. And so once again, this is probably a process that's going to take some time. And the final trend is that rhetoric does not work anymore in the Arab world. Countries that have not undergone transition have talked about what I call reform rhetoric. Some of them have perfected the art, some of them are not so good at it, but reform rhetoric, in other words, promises about implementing reform without actually implementing it, fools no one anymore in the Arab world. And the same goes for Islamist parties. Islam is a solution. Worked when Islamist parties were outside power. It does not work anymore when they are the ruling party if they cannot deliver results. Islam is the solution, does not deliver jobs, does not deliver investment. As people in Egypt are witnessing today, foreign reserves have gone down to 2 months of imports. You know, with the present situation, Egypt is going to face an economic cliff bigger than yours. And but if you look, if you look at the polls, you will see that even though Egyptians are a conservative society, and they probably have given Islamists the benefit of the doubt, not because they want a theocratic state, but because they feel Islamists are pious, clean people. They also want the Islamists to deliver. And so if you look at the polls, support for Islamists have gone up and down based on performance. It reached a peak when the parliamentary elections were held. Today, the Islamists have dropped at least 10 points in popular support from where they were during the elections. And in my view, we have seen the peak of support for Islamists around the Arab world. We have seen the peak. We will not see Islamists do better than what they have done. Why? Because they have now entered the political fray. They now have to deliver results, as I said, which will show them to be no better or worse than any other political party. And because the secular forces are, starting to organize. This does not mean that the loss of support for the Islamists is going to instantaneously and immediately translate into support for secular forces, because they're not organized. And so in the last Egyptian elections, as you know, only 30% of Egyptians went to the polls. The rest stayed home. That, of course, benefits the Islamists. But with time, probably in Egypt, I would say 2 election cycles, maybe 3, but I'm not worried about Egypt. I think Egypt will make it. They have too old a civilization, too homogeneous a population. They will make it, but not before they go through this process of change. How much time do I have, Nick? Let me just say a word about U.S. Policy and what the U.S. can do, something which has been asked repeatedly. I also think that the role of the U.S. is limited, and people have to get used to that, both people here and people in our region. The role of the US has been on the decline in the Middle East for three main reasons. Your military power has been shown to have limits after the Iraq War. Your economic power has been shown to have limits after the global financial crisis. And your political power has been shown to have limits after the inability or unwillingness of the United States to effect a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. So people look at the United States and they don't see it as relevant as they used to in any of these areas. This is basically a domestic issue, and it has to be allowed to take its course, because even if the United States wants to interfere, the tools that it has at its disposal are very limited. That is not to say that the United States cannot do anything, but you have to be realistic about what it can do. Something that the United States did not do well before was to pick winners and losers. Don't get into this game. Let the Arab world pick its winners and losers. You need to support the process of democratization, but don't support individuals as you did before. And don't talk to only one group and exclude the others, because that is not going to work. If the United States can do at least this well, I think it would be a major improvement. I call what is going on a second Arab awakening. I'm very excited about what is going on. I'm very excited that a process of change has started. And I, as an Arab individual, am willing to see all the turmoil that goes along with this process, because I realize this is a necessary phase that we have to go through, and that the old status quo, as I said, was not sustainable. Those who are nostalgic about Mubarak's days or about Ben Ali's days live in a world out of touch with reality. If this process takes 10 or 15 or 20 or even 30 years, that's fine, as long as some of the countries will make it towards prosperous societies. We've had an Arab awakening before in the region. It was an era of renaissance in the 19th century, when thinkers and educators and journalists in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, and elsewhere started talking about the need for the Arab world to get rid of foreign rule, Ottoman then colonial, started talking about the need of the Arab world to be exposed to other civilizations, from Tahtawi in Egypt to Taha Hussein. But they stopped, unfortunately. The first Arab awakening stopped at gaining independence and toppling dictators or foreign rule. This awakening cannot stop at this. We cannot afford to lose another 100 years by making this a battle between secular and Islamic elements. This awakening must be not just about toppling dictators, but about pluralism and putting in place the institutional mechanisms to ensure a pluralistic and prosperous Arab society. This is not a dream speech, and I don't think that everybody will make it in the Arab world. Some will. I'm very optimistic about Egypt. I'm very optimistic about Tunisia. I'm even optimistic about Morocco. Syria, Libya, Yemen are other issues. They will struggle for much longer before, hopefully, they too can arrive at pluralistic societies. But that battle has started, and I think it's a very exciting one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't you sit? We'll put Robin in the middle.
Okay.
Thanks, Jessica. Robin, please join us. Marwan, thank you so much You know, I was really struck that you decided to end on a note of relative optimism and really encouraged by that, because again, the news is always so bad. And there's so much that we can talk about from Marwan's presentation and Robin's joining us. When will a tsunami of change hit the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, as you spoke about at the beginning? Is it possible to see real democracies emerge in the Arab world over the next decade or so? A peak of Islamic influence. I was fascinated by that prediction that maybe we're seeing the cresting of this Islamic movement. And finally, what do we call these events? And I just want to ask both of you before we go to questions. Marwan talks about the Arab awakening, a second Arab awakening. Others talk about Arab revolution, Arab uprising. The press, unfortunately, called this the Arab Spring, which people don't use anymore. Marwan, the Arab awakening, you see a second Arab awakening developing culturally and politically.
I do. You know, the first Arab awakening was, as I said, an intellectual revolution that made its way decades later into popular revolutions against foreign rule. This one is actually starting the opposite way. It started with popular revolutions that have not yet made their way into intellectual frameworks. In other words, people of the Arab world today are more unanimous about what they are against than what they are for. This Arab awakening has not been defined yet, other than some general, of course, notions against despotism, for social, for dignity, for equity, etc. But this is not enough. Is not enough to build pluralistic societies. These are still general slogans that must be translated into clear programs. It is not going to be done in a decade. You asked me whether we will see real democracy in any Arab country in 10 years. I doubt it. Will we see people moving more towards democratic norms in some Arab countries in 10 years? I think so. Let's remember, if we take examples from Western and Eastern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Greece were not democracies until very recently. In Eastern Europe, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Poland today is doing much better than Romania or Bulgaria. So, I mean, you cannot treat the Arab world as sort of the pace of development in it as monolithic. You are going to see different paces. And on Saudi Arabia, ironically, the king, who is 89 to 92 years old, is the reformer in Saudi Arabia. Is considered a reformer. It's extremely ironic. If the king leaves the scene, none of his successors, we still might not know who they are, but all of the candidates are not reformers. And Saudi Arabia has real problems. I think Robin alluded to them yesterday. They have problems with inequities. They have problems with unemployment. They have problem with a Wahhabi doctrine that does not teach people to be tolerant of other cultures, of other views, of other religions. These are real problems. And once King Abdullah leaves the scene, I don't think that, that Saudi Arabia will continue to enjoy the stability that it enjoys today. Look at what is happening in Kuwait. Look at what happened in Bahrain. So even in these rich countries, the winds of change are blowing. They might not be blowing in the same way that they are in other Arab countries, but they're blowing nonetheless.
Thank you. Before we go to audience questions, Robin, what do you call what's happening?
Either awakening or uprisings generally. Spring is nice. The question is whether they're really revolutions. Revolutions tend to introduce, in the literal sense, in the academic sense, introduce new ideologies. And so in the last 400 or 500 years, you've seen three great revolutions. The French Revolution, because it introduced ideas of equality, the Russian Revolution in introducing communism and the idea of a different kind of equality, and the Islamic Revolution. These are the three ideologies that define the spectrum today. And we throw out ideas even of the American Revolution. Well, we didn't introduce anything new. What we had was an uprising, and it was an ouster of end of a colonial rule.
Boy, there's a debate here, but we won't go there. We'll disregard that.
Can I just say one thing about what Marwan said?
Yes.
And that is that we tend to think that, that the change is going to happen because of what we've seen in Tunisia and Libya and elsewhere, that it's a mass movement, begins peacefully, may end up picking up guns in order to oust dictators. That when it comes to the Gulf countries, you have a different dynamic playing out there. And for example, in Saudi Arabia, one of the things that's really interesting is that Abdulaziz, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, had 43 sons and even more daughters. And today there are over 60,000 princes in Saudi Arabia. And you're now into the second generation of sons who are aging. I think we counted 6 that are left. And then it will move to the third generation. And what they're really going to have to do is create a new royal family. And they're going to have to find a sliver of the original royal family that's going to kind of take over. And the others ain't going to be very happy about it. And that when you talk about change, that it will play out in lots of different ways in monarchies, I think. Jordan and Morocco being different cases, but in the Gulf particularly, that we tend to think there's kind of one trajectory. And I think there's also the pendulum does swing, and because of these instabilities, the danger is that we're not on not only not a straight trajectory, but that we could see real setbacks. When you look at Venezuela, which was the first democracy in Latin America in the early 1950s, and today you have Hugo Chavez in power, a former strongman who tried to engage in a military coup in the 1990s and then was subsequently democratically elected because of the chaos, the crime, and so forth. That when you look at Egypt, if things get really bad, does the Supreme Army Command, the SCAF, emerge again, and does it try to restore order? So there are a lot of it's not just a roller coaster, I have vertigo, this could be really bad political vertigo.
Okay. On that very positive note, let's go to questions from the audience. Yes, sir. Right here. And we'll go there second. Yeah, thanks.
Am I on? Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Charlie Graham, Camden. When I was first in Lebanon in 1972, I went to a party where the discussion of what the future of the Arab world was, and there seemed to be a group feeling that some kind of arbitrary combination of forces such as had taken place in Lebanon under the French, joining that country, would work throughout the Middle East, Syria, Jordan, even Israel, as a economic example for the pluralism you're talking about. And when Robin mentioned the increased tribalism, another one of the basic blocks of Arab society, is there any future for some kind of federalism appearing in the Levant and spreading to other areas of taking into balances as it has in Europe, as it did in the United States?
Okay, who wants to take that question? Marwan, do you want to?
You talk about Lebanon, which offers a very interesting example in the Arab world. On one level, Lebanon is a very failed state, politically dysfunctional state, not able to make any decision because of the presence of so many ethnic or religious groups in the country, and this division, of power among them in a sort of dysfunctional way. On the other hand, because of that diversity and the weak nature of the state, Lebanon has been able to offer a culture of intellectual freedom and of creativity that is not paralleled anywhere else in the Arab world. So what do you do? what do you do? Iraq, for example, has adopted the first part of the Lebanon model, in that it became also a sectarian state with political parties that are not national but sectarian, but kept the sort of repressive nature of the state in place so that you don't have in Iraq, even after Saddam Hussein left, you don't have an atmosphere of creativity and innovation. In my view, the problem is not whether you're going to have federalism or not. We might have federalism in some other Arab countries, particularly in the Levant, which, as Robin said yesterday, the Sykes-Picot agreement created these countries. I mean, they were not natural.
So many references to this. Just define who Sykes and Picot were for everybody.
Sykes was an English official. Picot was a French official. They met in 1916 secretly, and right after or in the middle of World War I, and decided how to carve the Arab world among them in case the Allies win the war. That agreement was kept secret until the Bolsheviks in Russia made it public after they came to power in 1917. But basically that agreement more or less defined what the Arab world is, at least in the Levant, is what it is today. Iraq was given to the British, and Iraq, Sir Charles Cox, what's his name? Percy Cox and Gertrude Bell basically, drew lines on the sand drew Iraq. Syria and Lebanon were given to the French. Palestine was given to the British, etc. So you might see in Iraq, for example, the Sunnis and the Kurds and the Shiites were put together in this state. In Lebanon, the Christians and the Muslims were put together in another state, etc. The question is not whether you have federalism or not. The question is whether you have an appreciation and an acceptance of diversity or not in the Arab world. That's what is lacking so far. We talked about education yesterday. Education is going to be crucial in moving forward, not in terms of making people literate, but in terms of the content of the educational process. Unless the educational systems in the Arab world are revisited to encourage critical thinking, questioning, research, communications, acceptance of other points of view, tolerance, if these are not embedded right from the beginning, it's going to be awfully difficult to arrive at pluralistic societies soon. And I'm not sure that, this is also, well, I am sure this is not being done so far, but it is a crucial component of building pluralistic societies that will probably take half a century before you can see the benefits.
Thank you, Marwan. We have a question right here.
Good morning, Dwight Leeper from Westfield, New Jersey. Thank you very much. My question for your optimism about the future of the Middle East over the next, let's say, 30 years is based on the hope that pluralism and democracy will become ever more present. Those things require institutional structures, which we in the West have a long history of institutional structures, the rule of law and such, that make our very messy democracy possible. Those structures do not necessarily exist in any great way in the Middle East. And how can you be optimistic, or why are you optimistic, given that there is a deficit of that kind of democratic structure? Thank you.
And so the creation not just of governmental structures, but civil society, civic structures that might provide the super.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I mean, if I gave a view that I'm optimistic about all Arab countries, then I will take that back, because I did not mean to do that. What I meant to say is some Arab countries will make it, not all of them in 30 years. This is a long process of change, precisely because of what you just said, sir, about the need to build institutions. But I think in a country as Egypt, the institutions are there. They have been weakened over the course of the last 60 years with one party and one man rule. But Egypt has what it takes, in my view, for these institutions to come back and be strong in 30 or 40 years. Syria is another matter. Libya is a country with oil and nothing else. And it's going to take, I don't know how, I mean, All I'm saying is some countries will make it in the Arab world, some will not, and others will struggle. But this is not going to be a uniform development across all countries.
Robin.
I guess I'd add only two very quick points. And one is we kind of assume that we're so much better when it comes to whether it's institution building or the ideas of democracy. And we have to remember that Hammurabi's Code was the first set of laws recorded in human history, and they came out of the Middle East. And there is, these ideas are not totally alien to them. Islam, in part, was built on redressing even things like women's rights. So, I think there's, again, we're a little skewed sometimes when we approach the whole subject. But you're right about institutions and civil society, and the trick is not just building civil society, it is building those groups that are inclusive of all others. But I want to go back to this point of federalism because it's related. It's such a boring word, but it's such an important idea. And I actually think that in a place like Libya, this will be very important. In Iraq, it will be very important. It is, how do you keep the bigger good, but take care of local concerns? And we found a way to do that in the United States. The European Union is in the process of trying to build that in the road to globalization, the process of building regional blocks that will allow local concerns to be addressed, but while taking care of whether it's defense or commerce and so forth, build larger entities. The Middle East is going through that process kind of on a small scale. It has to find a mechanism to take into account these emerging, whether it's re-emerging tribal concerns and religious identities, and still think about how you either keep a state together or you build a bigger entity. When it comes to the economic issues, Tunisia and Libya are natural allies because Tunisia has a bit more of the sophisticated infrastructure, development and institutions, and Libya's got the money. And so there are ways that that even as they're talking about how you create a new constitution and that takes into account all the local forces, that you also think about building something bigger. So it's a really important issue.
Thank you. Let's go to the balcony, and then we have a question subsequently from the remote location, right up here.
Hi, I'm Dawn from University of Maine, and thank you all for being here and coming to Maine when it's cold. But my questions are, you both have mentioned the next generation, and you mentioned that one of the factors of this entire, all the events that have been happening has been the high birth rate. What do you think the next generation is learning, and do you expect the high birth rate to continue and fuel it, or what do you expect to happen next?
Birth rate's going down.
Across the Arab world?
Pretty much, and that's really an interesting trend that you have this generation that is coming of age now and will be the defining force as it enters politics and takes over politics in the next 20 or 30 years. So you have a youth bulge now, but the birth rates have begun to go down. In Iran, one of my favorite stories is that when the Ayatollahs came to power, they called on women to breed an Islamic generation, and boy, did they. The population went from 34 million to 62 million in 10 years. And the Ayatollahs then recognized, oops, you can't feed, clothe, house, educate, or eventually employ all of those people. And they had brought the voting age for men and women down to 15. And they began to realize, that they were going to be a political force as well. And so they did a number of things. They raised the voting age to 16 and then 18. But they also introduced a family planning program that was the most effective. It won the UN highest award for family planning programs. And everything became free. Condoms, Norplan, IUD, tubal ligation, vasectomy. The water tower in Tehran has, where's Hussein?
Right here.
Right here. It had a sign that said vasectomy clinic here. And I went to it with a local cleric who was taking some of his congregation. And you know, there was this. They brought the birth rate. The average birth rate was over 7 children per family, down to around 2, and I think it's even a little bit lower than 2 now. Being realistic, and there is this kind of awakening about demographics that has begun to change. It's not nearly as dramatic in the Arab world, but it has gone down, and so they're going to go through their baby boom just like we have in the United States.
Thank you. Marwan.
I just came back from Egypt, where we had a session with youth from many countries in the Arab world. We had youth from Egypt, from Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, Lebanon, Yemen. And it was fascinating. These are all people under 30 years of age. It's fascinating to hear them speak. One, you know, this is not the generation of their parents. In fact, Lisa Anderson, the American University of Cairo president, I think summarized it best when she said, this generation revolted, not against their parents, but on their behalf. They are not ready to live by the rules that their parents did. Many of them feel the revolutions have been stolen away from them. You know, they started the revolution in Egypt. They're not reaping its benefits. Same in Tunisia. Why? Because they're realizing just now that whereas they wanted to be leaderless at first, they did not believe in leaders. They did not believe in political structures. They believed in, you know, the power of the world and the energy of going to the street. But now they're starting to find out that this is not enough to translate this into political programs. So they're starting to organize now, and they don't know how. They still have a vacuum of leadership. They don't know how to do it, but they're full of energy. They're very candid. They're not afraid, like their parents were, of, you know, speaking out in a very candid way. And that's, to me, is extremely encouraging. They will take time before they channel their energies, and I hope they don't grow too old before they do this and lose that youthful energy. But I have a lot of hope in them. I talk a lot to them, both face-to-face, through Facebook and other means. There's a lot of energy there, and a lot of hope, and a lot of belief that they can do something.
This is a fascinating discussion. We only have time maybe for 2 more questions. We'll go to one of our colleagues, John von Sicklen in Rockland. Will the Jordanian monarchy survive? Marwan, that's your question. Or maybe it's Robin's question.
So,
Go ahead, Robin. Look, the monarchy in Jordan is not so far, you know, being fought by the people. In other words, the monarchy is needed in the country because it is seen as a unifying force for all the different ethnic groups in the country. The East Jordanians, the Palestinians, they all want them. And in fact, they don't only want the monarchy, they want the monarchy to have real powers. They don't want it to be a constitutional monarchy because on existential issues facing Jordan, they want an arbiter. And so far, these both groups don't have a better arbiter than the king. Having said that, people in Jordan don't want the monarchy to keep on running the daily affairs of the country the way it is doing now. They want real power sharing within the existing regime. And I think to the extent that the monarchy is forthcoming and is responsive to people's demands for real change within the system, then yes, it can survive.
to have a small point,
Yep.
I think that in the Gulf generally, you're going to see, not necessarily in Saudi Arabia, but a move increasingly for stronger parliaments to have real powers and to make a very gradual transition to constitutional monarchies, more so in Morocco and Jordan than in the Gulf. But it's something that has to happen. And I'll leave it there.
So we literally have 1 minute, 30 seconds left. You two should take this show on the road because this is very interesting. You really should. A half a minute each. I mean, your last words, because Robin's got to leave and go back to DC.
My last word is I don't believe what is needed is so much taking it on the road than taking it inside our countries. And I think we need to work on the ground.
Thank you. Robin.
What have I not said?
Are you hopeful?
Well, I said last night, long term, I am. I think I'm hopeful about, you can ask the same question about the Soviet Union or Venezuela or South Africa. We ask this question all the time. Are we hopeful in the course of human history? And if you take us as a model, yeah, we evolve. But boy, we have to evolve, and that means opening minds. And the great hope of the region is that you have the young, and the fear is the most important thing, that they're not afraid. When I asked my Egyptian friend if she was afraid about the future, the young girl who'd been circumcised, and she said, I'm concerned about the future because we don't have democratic institutions. They're all young, fragile. We don't have the resources. We don't have the experience. We don't have the organized parties. But am I afraid? She said, no, because at the end of the day, I know I've got power now. I used it once, and I'll use it again.
Wow. That's a great way to end this session. Thanks so much to both of you.